Hey guys, what is up? Today we're going to be talking about Lulu and how best to build her. So Lulu is a pretty good card and quite a bit better than she might immediately seem, or even as a comparison to Tarek as well. I think Lulu is going to be much more competitive, and there's a couple of different ways to build around her. So Lulu is a 3 mana 2/3 that has support. My supported ally grows up to 4/4 this round and levels up as long as your allies have been supported 3+ times, which means she has the ability to gain level triggers when she's in hand or in deck, right? Which is very, very different from Tarek, who needs to be on board to level up. Then when she levels up, she starts creating the fleeting help pixes in hand every round, which can give you that round barrier or vulnerable to a target of your choice. And then you have the ability to support to a 5/5 instead of to a 4/4, right? It's notable that the ally grows up to that, which means that presumably she won't be able to reduce stats below their current amount to get to 4. So for example, if you use her with Braum, should be a 4/5 instead of a 4/4, though it doesn't really matter too much. So basically how you want to build her is you have 2 or 3 really, really solid tempo applications. The best example I would say right now is to build her with Demacia, is probably where she's going to find her home. And I think a lot of people agree on this. Pairing her with presumably Fleet Feather Tracker, there's a couple of other openers, is going to be absolutely insane. Getting a tracker on turn 3 to attack with 4/4 stat line is ridiculous, and she has a very, very similar impact to the game as something like Callista, where she's just a turn 3, like, sort of like tempo monster that if flipped can be even more ridiculous. I think that you absolutely want to run her in that same capacity, in a deck that has the ability to like curve out an early nut draw, and I really like the ability for something like Flame Chompers to hit a Lulu deck as well, just because you really want to open yourself up to having like a temporary 4/4 challenger on turn 3 on your attack is just so insanely like game winning when that happens. So I think you're sort of like remiss if you don't at least give your deck the option of having the early challenger to combine with Lulu. And that's why I think some of the other options, like for example, she could be pretty good in something like Shadow Isles with Callista even, but I am a little bit more hesitant to go for that direction because they don't have a good support like Demacia might have War Chefs, and they don't have a good early challenger that you want to be like keeping alive. They've got the ephemeral challengers, but it's less valuable if you can't keep the unit alive. So let's just go ahead and build. Again, this is going to be more of a concept thing. I can't obviously build the 40 card deck because we don't know exactly like what the new card pool is going to look like or what the new meta is going to incentivize. What I can do, however, is to start like showing you guys the framework of where I see Lulu being best built. And definitely the like Demacia curve direction is going to be really where I love her potential at. I will say something that's really, really big is that Demacia, I feel like, especially since Bannerman has gotten nerfed, I feel like they've sort of been very okay with the idea of getting out of the Bannerman direction, especially now that they have a reason to. This deck definitely wouldn't be running something like Vanguard Bannerman, and instead would go for kind of like the more standard Demacia curve style, right? So we'd run kind of all the usual suspects. War Chefs is going to be really good, you know, a couple of single combats, probably, you know, could be considered a bit of a meta-dependent call, but this sort of like opener shell is going to be best, right? You want to open yourself up to Tracker on 1, War Chefs on 2, and Lulu on 3. That sort of thing will happen pretty commonly, but even if you have to have a replacement, even if it's like Tracker on turn 1 into Brightsteel Protector on turn 2 into Lulu on 3, that's still going to be really, really effective. We're going to have a few of the additional support cards that are coming in big. She often won't be flipping in that deck just because you won't necessarily have enough support for her, but she's always going to be hitting insanely good value. I think there's a good chance we might want to run Young Witch in this deck as well. So basically, it's a curvy Demacia deck. You're running a lot of like Ione cards, a lot of support cards. We're not going to be into like either Allegiance, a lot of barrier effects. We probably won't run enough barrier effects for something like Green Glade Caretaker to make sense, but what I really do like is the potential to actually fit in Flower Child into this deck. This is kind of like the one deck that I think has a decent chance of being able to fit in Flower Child. You might want the additional 1-drop to be able to have like good support, and it can actually get like potentially a little bit nasty with some of these tools. I'd also like to point out Young Witch is actually a pretty good combo with Fleet Feather Tracker. I'm not 100% sure if it would be quite worth running in this list, but it does hit a few synergy points. It's great to curve out with Tracker, and Quick Attack plus Challenger is, of course, very good. It can help your Lulu level up in a bind. Lastly, we could consider Fiora, but I don't know if it would be worth fitting in over Lulu and Shen. Again, could be a bit of a meta-dependent option, right? And I'll make one final point, which is we could actually fit in the Fuzzy Caretaker. Because Fuzzy Caretaker, it was a card that when I first looked at it, it felt pretty underwhelming. But I think it has a pretty good home in this list. The ability to have like 1 or 2 additional supports is pretty powerful. I don't know, I don't think I would run it as something like a 3 of, but since Lulu is such a power card, it works so well in this deck, you really want to draw a support on turn 4 and just like multi-trigger supports. Like this will instantly level Lulu. I could see Fuzzy Caretaker hitting this list in a really, really degenerate way. So I'm going to have to go back and reevaluate Fuzzy Caretaker because its combo with Lulu is just so good. The ability for you to play Lulu on 3 and then Caretaker on 4, and in a lot of board states that will literally instantly flip her, that is good. So Caretaker is a much, much, much better card just because of Lulu's ability to synergize with it. And that's basically the general shell of the deck, right? Apart from that, it's going to have kind of all your usual suspects in like Ionia, Demacia, and it'll play very much like a curve strategy like we've seen like Fiora Shens do in the past. Usually, we're going to be looking for a powerful Demacia finisher in the form of something like Cytherea or Genevieve. I don't really like running stuff like Bright Steel Formation. Even in like Shen decks, it feels like a little inconsistent and baity, and you want an earlier, cheaper finisher to be coming down. So yeah, this style of deck is by far where I see Lulu having the most potential. Now, I'm going to give you guys a couple of other ideas, and these ones are unfortunately going to be less fleshed out just because they'll kind of only work if we see a little bit more support with them. But I mentioned that I also really like the direction of Flame Chompers, right? Because again, it's another very accessible, very cheap card that can work very well with tempo decks. And if given like that buff, that +4, it's not +4/+4, but it's sending it into a 4/4 with Lulu is pretty good. And now that we have Zonite Urchin, this is a really early play that can make a lot of sense and hit for a lot of value. PNC also gives us the ability to swarm the board, which is something that I think people are sort of like underrating the value of in a deck that needs a few support cards, because it's going to be super imperative that you have enough units to even get all the buffs on your support, especially if we want to be running Fuzzy Caretaker, because keep in mind, Fuzzy Caretaker needs a support and a like non-supported card, right? So you need to have like to make absolute certain that you will have enough units, especially if you want the granularity of being able to support different things. You want a pretty wide board, and PNZ will really help you with that, in addition to giving you that early champion, early challenger role. Now, where PNZ falls off a little bit is their ability to like perform well with some of these like aggro tools. I'm not sure if they're quite on the level when it comes to having like enough of the additional options, right? Because here's where you have to start dipping into your Ionia cards. So this one's definitely less fleshed out than Demacia, but I would consider it an idea that has a lot of potential as well. And finally, I'll mention something else that's kind of pure theory, and this is quite interesting, which is the idea of a deck that actually skews very Ionian and runs Kinku Wayfinder. Because Lulu's adding a lot of like Ionia mid-range beef card, we can pair her easily with something like Zed as well to help just kind of hammer down that tempo theme, right? So we can pair her with Zed, run a lot of the Ionia beefs, a lot of the cards we saw in the Demacia version, but instead of running too many Demacia cards, we shell it mostly Ionian, and we run Kinku Wayfinder to be able to pull out Fleet Feather Tracker. So it's similar to the first deck that I showed, except instead of skewing into Demacia, we keep our Demacia portion a little bit lean and go into the Kinko Wayfinder direction as well. I think it's actually very, 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 very possible for a deck like this to even fit in a card that we haven't really seen before, which is Rush. Now, I know this seems a little bit weird, but bear with me. I think Rush is a decent card that sort of hasn't made sense historically, just because it's a tempo card in Ionia, and Ionia tempo decks usually want to win the game with elusives instead of playing for the board. But it's good with challenger units, and it's good with support units, because units like Lulu are often wanting to be able to be attacking, but sometimes they'll kind of, you know, get blocked and killed. So you want a cheap combat trick. Now, it's very, very important that your combat trick is cheap, because the other thing about the support builds with, you know, Lulu and the others is that you're often going to have to be spending almost all of your mana because you need to develop the board, which means you're not going to have enough mana for a more expensive combat trick. Enter Rush, a card that's great with challengers, a card that's great with supports, and a card that's great with the idea of like a very early aggressive tempo deck. It saw a decent amount of play in the preview patches and kind of like ended up underwhelming everyone after that. But I think that this card is a potential sleeper in this archetype of a deck and will help allow you to find enough decent Ionia cards to justify something like Kinku Wayfinder. This version could be running Shen instead of Zed as well, and if you're in the Shen route, you could definitely opt for Greenglade Caretaker to be your other one-drop coming out of Fleet Feather Tracker, right? So that could be Shen instead of Zed. There's a few different ways to run this, right? But Lulu's the second champion, and you're running pretty much as much support as you can. You could even do a weird kind of mix-up where you have, you know, maybe not even 2 different champions. You could add in like a one of somewhere along the way. It's not impossible. But this is kind of, I would say actually, a pretty high potential deck. I really like the idea of using Wayfinder in this way. I like the idea of Rush being able to get in here, and it seems like Ionia's getting a lot of tools to be able to get out of the identity of elusives. Like, Ionia now has a lot of like early tempo options that don't have to be tied into the elusive game plan, because Lulu is absolutely a power card in a deck like this. Lastly, I'll give an honorable mention to Targon because, yes, Lulu and Targon are definitely going to want to be combined, but I think that building that deck is kind of a little too easy. Like, we haven't seen many Targon cards before, and most of the ones we've seen so far have just been like, you know, Tarek and all the support package. So, for what we know right now, building like what we expect to be a decent shell for like a Lulu Targon, like Ionia Targon mid-range tempo support style archetype is going to be pretty much just throwing in all the cards we've seen so far, right? It's pretty easy. Like, we all can think about that, you know, just putting like Lulu with Tarek, running like some of the support cards, running some of the gem cards, kind of slapping it all together, right? We haven't seen enough of Targon to know like which cards to add and which cards to not. So it's very true that that sort of build will definitely be one of the best ways to play Lulu, but it's kind of like there's not really deck building to be done there yet in that department. Right? Because until we know what the rest of the Targon cards are going to be, we won't really have an idea of what to exclude, right? As we've seen so far, pretty much all the Targon cards work well with this strategy. Alright guys, that's it for my kind of like daily wrap up on how to use this new champion. I think that it's a very powerful card. It is less versatile than Tarek, but definitely on a stronger power level.